Good morning. Okay, we're going to move on with the service. If you would like to take a seat, that would be great. Remember, we've got lots of time afterwards to socialize as well, so do hang around afterwards and connect with one another. Again, welcome. My name's Matthew. I'm the lead pastor here, and everybody here right now, you are really welcome. So glad you're joining us online as well. Thanks for being with us. And we hope you feel very much at home. We're in the middle of a series. We're really coming to the end of a series for the season of Lent. It's Palm Sunday, and then we're into Easter and all of that shortly. This season of Lent, though, we've been going through a section in the Bible which has become known as the Sermon on the Mount. It's in Matthew chapter 5 through to chapter 7. And we have been going through that, pretty much, I wouldn't say exactly verse by verse, although today we'll look at pretty much every verse in the passage we've assigned. And we've been exploring how, in many ways, this teaching of Jesus in that section is like a manifesto. It's like Jesus laying out his premise for what it means to live in what he calls in Matthew's account, the kingdom of heaven, this way of love, this way of living in the divine realm, if you like, living the kind of life that Jesus lived and the kind of life that Jesus invites us into. And in this section, in this whole Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about the reality of the world, which is unjust and not right. And I think we all relate to that. We see injustice all around us, and we can't ignore it, and we're not going to ignore it. And Jesus talks about ways that we can bring healing to that injustice without creating even more injustice, right? And we see in the course of human history the cycles of violence, overcoming violence, and just never being resolved. And Jesus talks about some incredible ways to forgive and love and bring about healing. And Jesus also talks about a lot of very challenging things personally, because Jesus is saying, look, if we want that kind of life, then the change begins with us. And last week we were talking about the fact that Jesus is saying, look, you can have all this great religion and all these great religious practices, but what's really going on the inside? And calling us to be, as we talked about last week, aligned with the love of God, to live integrated lives where our spiritual practice, the way we behave, the way we act, flows out of what's going on the inside. In other words, we're not faking it. We're not, as Jesus would say, hypocrites. We're not practicing one thing and doing one thing, but really that's just covering up from what's going on inside us. And we talked about that kind of alignment being not easy, because there are all kinds of things that sort of pull us away from that alignment. And Jesus addressed some of those things in what we looked at last week. So I'm not going to redo last week, but let's just start off at this point that we kind of left off, which was Jesus saying, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And we talked about the fact that this kind of, in some respects, summarized everything that Jesus has said just before these few verses. And Jesus isn't here saying, look, don't worry about this present life. Your treasure will be in this life after death experience that you're going to have. So just invest in that. Jesus is talking about the life in the here and now. And the kingdom of heaven is something he's inviting us into in the here and now. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and that we can live this kind of life. But it's like we're not always aligned that way. And Jesus is calling us back to that alignment, saying, okay, where your treasure is, that's where your identity is going to be. What you really value is where your identity is going to be. And Jesus is calling us to have a different set of values, right? A different set of values. Now, this then leads into this next section that we're going to look at today. And as I've mentioned, it's a little bit shorter, and we're going to pretty much go through that section verse, but we're going to look at all the verses in that section. We won't sort of analyze every single one exactly. But Jesus, first of all, goes on and says, right after that, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? And this begins this sort of metaphor of the eye that Jesus uses in this section that we're going to look at today. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. That word healthy, if you read, so this is from the New International Version, and if you read that in a proper Bible, not just a slide on the screen, there's a little footnote there, and it says that the word for healthy has connotations with generosity. And I looked at that word, and the word is haplous in the Greek. And I couldn't find any evidence of it being connected to generosity. There's a reason why I think commentators think it could be associated with that. But when you look at the actual word, it's only used once in the whole of the Gospel of Matthew. And when you look at the root of the word, the root is more to do with singularity or clarity or focus. And that's kind of makes sense with talking about an eye. But I think this is, again, Jesus saying, if we have this sort of divided mind, this divided heart, if we're not aligned, if our hearts aren't lined up in the flow of God's love, then the way we see and the way we interpret what's going on around us is going to be jarred and out of sync and create all kinds of tension and anxiety and dissonance for us, and could actually lead into us living stressed out, not particularly healthy kind of lives that are more about darkness than they are about light. He goes on to say, and I think this is these next few verses give us a little bit of context for how we might think about the eye in that situation. No one can serve two masters. So here's this issue of division, divided loyalties. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So this translation, the New International Version, sort of really is saying it's about money, the evil of money. And I think we all get that money can be a distraction. Money can be as the Bible has said, the root of all evil. Well, we relate to that. But actually, if we look again at the original language and perhaps look at some ways other translations of the Bible view this. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. That word mammon, it's kind of a clumsy word in a way, isn't it? Or it means all sorts of things to different people. But what's happened here, if you look at the original language, and let's remember, as we were talking about last week, that for us to get the Bible is a pretty complicated process, right? So Jesus said some things. He spoke Aramaic, that was his native language. Before we're reading it on a screen or in our Bibles, that was remembered by some people. And then it was written down from the memories of those people by people who actually wrote it, on parchment. But it was written in Greek, another language, the sort of the lingua franca of the day. And then we translate the Greek into English. So there's a whole bunch of stages that have gone for us getting the Bible. And I think one reaction to that, one thing we should be very keen about is what a privilege we have to have the scriptures, right? And so most people throughout the history of Christianity, people who've been following Jesus for about 2,000 years, it's only in the last 25% of that people have had access to the Bible in their own language. If you think about it, so for 1,500 years, you would rely on somebody translating it from the Greek or later on from the Latin for you on your behalf. We could just put a slide up, and so we should be very grateful. And secondly, we need to be careful. We just need to be respectful and humble about the way we approach the Bible, recognizing that it's complex. Even just the interpretations are complex and the translations are complex. So we're going to just be sort of gentle in the way that we interpret and gentle in the way that we apply it. But this term mammon is a Aramaic word. It's so in the Greek it's transliterated. It's just using that Aramaic but with Greek letters. And if you look at the root of that word, it's more to do with not just money, but desire. The root of the word is desire. So in other words, Jesus here is talking about the divided desires that we have. Again, seems to be saying, if you're not aligned, it's going to be hard to live in this kingdom. If we align ourselves, if we let go, as we were talking about last week, about the things that tether us and that hold us back and that push us off center. And that's a journey. None of us get there instantly. But as we begin to let go of some things, we become more aligned. And it's not just about money. It's about all kinds of things in our lives, our popularity, our security in all sorts of different ways, not just financial. We defend and preserve ourselves in all kinds of ways that aren't necessarily ultimately really healthy for ourselves or healthy for other people. Now, Jesus then goes on to say, therefore, so building off what in these first few sentences he's been talking about, therefore I tell you, and we go now into a passage which I think is quite famous, even outside of religious circles. A lot of language from this passage will probably feel somewhat familiar. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you have little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Okay, a familiar passage, I think, in some respects. And there's something so beautiful about this, right? Something so beautiful about this. We're just going to break this down a little bit. So Jesus is saying, don't worry. So a few things we can say about this passage. Jesus seems pretty happy, right? There's something really beautiful about this. You get the feel of Jesus being at one with his Father, at one with God, at one with, at one with the divine realm, at one with nature, at one with the material realm, and seeing those as one whole, not sort of separating those out. There's something really beautiful. This is kind of like the Zen Jesus, right? The sort of the chilled out Jesus. And there's something so attractive about that. But there's also, if you're anything like me, someone who has had a lifelong struggle with anxiety, who still struggles with anxiety, there's a sort of nagging feeling in the back of our minds, I think. Is Jesus really real? Does Jesus get it? There's plenty to worry about, right? Because there's plenty to worry about in the world, in your life, in my life. There really is. And I don't think this is an escapist Jesus, right? Just bury your head in the sand, don't worry. I think Jesus wants to be very tuned in to reality. Jesus, if we think about two examples of two stories about Jesus that we read in the Gospels, one is another kind of chilled out version of Jesus, asleep in a boat when he's in a storm on a lake. And he's surrounded by people who are trying to sail the boat, who kind of find him pretty annoying because he's just sleeping when they think they're sinking, right? But then there's another story about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. We'll be looking at that on Good Friday, where Jesus is so anxious and afraid, he sweats. And in Luke's version of the story, it says he sweats like drops of blood. I mean, it's graphic fear and anxiety. But in that fear and anxiety, Jesus finds a way to let go and surrender and say, okay, it's not my will, but your will be done, which is this ultimate act of letting go. So Jesus knows the reality of life. I don't think Jesus is here saying, look, basically spirituality is all about just closing your eyes and pretending certain things aren't there. Jesus is finding a way for us through this. Now he says, you have little faith. In other words, Jesus seems to be in this place of trust. Okay, he's trusting, he's calling us to trust God, and he's living a life of trust himself. And there's something really beautiful and compelling about that, as we were saying. But he calls us, or the people listening to him at the time, you have little faith. And it almost sounds condemning, doesn't it? It's like, God, you have little faith. Well, it's actually, in the Greek, again, it's only one word. It's oligopistos, which means oligo meaning few or small or little, and pistos meaning faith, or perhaps better translated, trust. So maybe this is Jesus using a diminutive term like faithling or little faith ones. In other words, it's not just that, oh, you've got no faith or you're useless, but rather, okay, Jesus empathizing with us that we find it hard to trust. Our trust is small, but it's the beginning. Jesus is calling us into a journey, and that we can grow it. We can grow in that. We're like children with our faith, children with our trust. It's growing in us, and we're being called into something more trusting, a deeper kind of trust. And Jesus says, okay, the way to do that is to seek first his kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, this way of love. If that becomes our priority, if that becomes what sets our agenda, our value system, maybe we can begin to let go of the worries and the tensions that are just a normal part of life for us, a normal part of life. So Jesus says, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. So here Jesus is saying, worry is a reality, right? I don't think Jesus is actually saying here, it's really wrong to be anxious. But Jesus seems to be saying, live in the moment, live in this present moment. There's things about tomorrow that you can't control, that may represent giants to us that turn out not to be giants, but they kind of get blown up in our minds. Tomorrow will probably have trouble, just as today has trouble. We'll come to that in a second. But Jesus is saying, let go and live in this moment. Now, I think by definition, perhaps Jesus is also saying, let go of the past, or by implications, should I say. Jesus is also saying, let go of the past. So, and as someone who struggles with anxiety, I know I worry a lot about tomorrow. And I worry about worrying because I don't want to worry all the time. So, and then I try to stop worrying, and I'm not very good at it, and that makes me worry more. I worry that I'll never get over my worry. I don't know if I don't want to talk too much about that in case you start doing it as well, that because you thought, oh, maybe I should be worried about that, But anyway, that's kind of how anxiety works. So, worry about the future I can relate to that. But I also worry about the past. I don't know whether you have that. Like, I think anxiety can come from regrets about the past. Maybe, if only I hadn't made that decision, if I only done this, and I wouldn't be in this situation now, etc. We might have guilt or shame about it, or just regret. Our life hasn't turned out the way that we thought it would, or we wanted it to. Maybe we feel we're not where we should. We're way back further down the pathway than we should be, etc., etc. And that all loads up as anxiety on us. Maybe we look back in the past and there's a sort of a purple patch for us, or the heyday, or the good old days, or when things were going well. And that, rather than that be a source of encouragement to us, it's sort of that voice behind saying, that was as good as it got. It's as good as it gets. Everywhere, everything now is downhill. Or, we might feel that influence from our past. Maybe that's something that happens to us more as we get older. I don't know. So if you've never thought that before, I don't want to sow the seeds of that kind of in your mind. But do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. And then right in the next half of that verse, each day has enough trouble of its own. So Jesus is implying there's good reason to worry. And maybe you could almost interpret this passage is that Jesus is saying, go ahead and worry, but just worry about today, right? The trouble of today. Now, I don't think Jesus is saying that. Jesus is using these various different metaphors and ways of describing the nature of anxiety and the kingdom of heaven and trust in our Father, as Jesus coins the term. But can we, in this moment, perhaps be content with what is? So each day has enough trouble of its own, but each day is what it is, right? And this is not a denial of reasons to worry, but a way to handle those worries, a way to handle our anxiety, to be able to say, okay, in this moment, God is present to me, and what I have right now just is. And I'm going to take that as sufficient for me right now. As opposed to saying, I wish it could be this, I wish I had more, I wish that hadn't happened, which are the sort of tendencies I think that we all fall into. So Jesus is trying to give us a way to let go of anxiety, because anxiety can take us off this alignment with the flow of love, right? We go out, we start trying to control people, control our own circumstances, or we retreat into a sense of perhaps negative thinking and resentment and fear that can paralyze us. Jesus is encouraging us to open up, to align, and to just sort of flow in what is, which is God is love. Now, Jesus goes on right away to address another issue that I think can get quite emotional for us. And this is the whole issue of judging. Again, I think this is a fairly famous concept from teachings of Jesus. Do not judge, that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. So this is another very sort of, I think, pretty well known, somewhat relatable, but very challenging teaching of Jesus, right? So I think we all get that judging is a problem, right? It's a, and I think we might even say that, especially in religion. Religion can be very judgmental, but I think actually humanity is pretty judgmental, right? You step outside of different religions, there's plenty of judgment going around, which is really unhelpful. I think this certainly over the years, my interpretation of this, or my sort of gut feel, my emotional reaction to this is, yeah, we're judgmental, so we shouldn't judge. And so we sort of tiptoe around having an opinion or expressing an opinion, right? And so that could even cause us to see things that are really wrong and not say anything about them. And I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about here, because Jesus was constantly calling people out, right? So especially religious people saying, and interestingly, I don't know, we'll come to this in a second, but there's some irony in even this passage, because Jesus says, you hypocrite, take the log out of your own eye. Now, if I called anybody in this room a hypocrite, I think you would think that was pretty judgmental. So there's some irony here in that Jesus is talking about not judging and is judging. He's calling somebody a hypocrite. So that should at least kind of wake us up to, okay, what's really going on here? What is Jesus really talking about? I don't think Jesus is saying just tiptoe around stuff without expressing an opinion or having an opinion. And if that's how we live life, and if that's how so many people before us have lived their lives, so many issues in the world would never have got addressed, right? Because things need to be addressed. Things need to be called out, because the world isn't the way it's meant to be. That's why Jesus said, pray that your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, because things aren't right. So what is Jesus saying here? So Jesus is saying, don't judge. I think what Jesus is getting at here is, what kind of a universe do you want to live in? We in the Lord's Prayer, we read a couple of weeks ago, oh no, that was last week, wasn't it? We read, if you forgive others, God will forgive you. If you don't forgive others, God won't forgive you. And that sounds a little harsh, but it's really like, what reality do you want? Do you want a reality of forgiveness? In which case, you can experience forgiveness, but you also deal in forgiveness and forgive others. Likewise, what kind of a universe do we want? Do we want a universe that's full of judgment, or do we want a universe that's full of mercy? I know which one I want to choose. But I think we tend to want to participate in a universe where we get to judge and everybody else gets to extend mercy to us, right? So that's our tendency. But Jesus is saying it is what it is. What do you want? Pick a lane, kind of thing. So what is the speck? So we all have specks. So here we have the eye metaphor again, the speck, it seems, is perhaps based on what we talked about earlier with the metaphor of the eye, the specks are things that cause us to act out, things that cause us to behave inappropriately, things that create attitudes in us, things that aren't aligned. This lack of singularity, lack of clarity. So loving, we're kind of pushed off that base because of maybe our insecurities or because of anger issues or whatever it is, right? So there's certain dysfunctions that push us off alignment with the flow of love. And Jesus is using an analogy of the speck in the eye, right? Because he's talked about these eyes before. So what is the speck? Well, the speck is all kinds of stuff that we all experience. We all have specks, right? And I'm not talking about spectacles. We all have specks in our eyes. And has anybody literally had a speck in their eye? Have you? It's really uncomfortable, right? It's really horrible. It's really uncomfortable. And I remember back in my medical days, removing speck. People would come into the ER for removal of things in their eyes, and they were so relieved when the speck was removed. Whatever it was, it's just this, and it feels at times like a log, right? It's there. So actually, and the passage ends with specks being removed. There's something beautiful about having a speck removed, right? So I don't think, again, Jesus is saying, ignore everybody's specks, or just walk around not saying anything about anything. And specks are a reality. And by the trajectory of this passage, Jesus seems to be suggesting that we need to help one another with our specks. We'll get to that. But the speck is, let's say, dysfunctions that we see in other people. What is the log? Well, I think Jesus is saying here, the log's another speck, but it's about perspective, right? So if we take a speck and it's in our eye, the perspective is it's blocking a lot of our vision. It's like a log because it's so much closer. The speck in somebody else's eye is this tiny little thing. Well, this might be a tiny little thing, but because it's here, we can't even see out of that eye. And we probably experienced that if we've had things in our eyes. So the log and the speck are the same thing, really. So the log then is what's in our eye, our dysfunctions, our inability actually to help somebody else because of what's going on in our own life. And that might be, let's think about this. It might just be lack of information, right? We're seeing something in somebody else or in another country, like weapons of mass destruction, right? That was a big lack of information, which resulted in a judgment that caused havoc. So even on that scale, this kind of thing happens. It might just be lack of information. We don't understand enough about what's going on there. That's probably inevitable in most situations. But it also might be, so if I'm feeling defensive because of stuff that's happened in my life, I might see behavior in somebody else as aggressive when it's just normal behavior. It's just in my defensiveness, I'm interpreting it a different way. And that's the log in my eye creating a problem. Or I might be super aggressive and I interpret defensiveness in somebody else as defensiveness, but it's actually just normal behavior. Or I might be feeling really insecure and then somebody says something that to me sounds unkind, but it's not unkind. That's my insecurity playing out. So, and I think we can all relate to that, right? We're all like that. We know we all have specks. The issue here is not, are there any specks? The issue here is being aware of those specks. And the intention here, I think, of what Jesus is saying is getting to a place of healing, but in an appropriate, merciful, kind way. He says, again, you hypocrite. So Jesus is getting here, I think, at our tendency to judge somebody else without doing the work in our own lives, of working at those specks in our own eyes, the dysfunctions in our own lives that can lead us to a different place. That's the hypocrisy of it. By definition, Jesus is making a judgment call here, saying that's hypocrisy. That's Jesus making a call, making a judgment call. So Jesus is not saying that judging is inappropriate or having an opinion is inappropriate. It's how you deal with that and how you go about it. And goes on to say, to close out this section, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. So Jesus isn't saying, don't take the speck out of somebody else's eye. Jesus isn't saying, don't have an opinion. Jesus isn't saying even don't talk about things. The assumption here is that in relationships, we all have specks and we need help, right? We all need help. Like some of us become aware of specks and it's like we don't know what to do about it. And we actually pay somebody to help us with it, therapists or psychiatrists, because we need to process that. Jesus is saying in the course of relationships, it would be quite normal, I think, for us to take specks out of one another's eye. We need it. And actually, it can be a beautiful thing, right? When that speck comes out, it's relieving, it's helpful. But don't even think about doing that unless you've done the work yourself. And with works in progress, obviously. But if we're not looking at ourselves, then Jesus is saying, you're going to wreak havoc. You won't be able to take a speck out. In fact, Jesus in Proverbs, it says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. So in other words, the delicate, tricky thing of speck removing can be really painful, but it's actually, when done in love, it's a faithful wound, which is the opposite of not allowing specks to be removed from our own lives. And again, I think we can all relate to this. We've had people close to us who've said some of the hardest things that we've really needed to hear. And we often reject or accept those based on how it's said and the relationship we have with the people and the love or not that we have with the people. And the tendency would be for us all, I mean, I do this, you go to people who are going to kiss you, right? Because and who maybe wouldn't have the courage to say something to you. That's where we often run to avoid having to deal with that speck. And I think Jesus is saying we need each other. We need each other, and that's going to be messy and difficult. So work at your own specks. Now, right after this next verse, Jesus says, do not give what is holy to dogs, nor do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you. I'll be honest, I don't really know what this means at all, just to be honest. And I was going to skip through it. I said to Greg before the series, I might just skip over that one, but it's there, and it comes right after this judgment section. So I wonder, and I think a lot of people have interpreted this as, when you take the metaphor of a dog, that was a derogatory term for non-Jewish people at that time. The metaphor of swine, pigs, is sort of a non-Jewish thing. So this could be Jesus saying things like, you better be careful if you're judging the Romans or judging people who have a lot of power, or holding them to certain standards that, especially if you're not holding to those standards yourself, you might get in big trouble. It could be that. I just wonder also whether it's Jesus immediately after talking about judgment. So like if you just walk around judging people without doing the work yourself, you're going to get into big trouble. That's a recipe for disaster, and that we should be really careful with all the way we handle these situations and the way we behave with one another. Okay, Jesus wraps up this section with this passage: ask and it will be given to you, search and you will find, knock and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks the door will be opened. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asked for bread, would give you a stone? Or if your child asked for a fish, would give you a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So, again, this is one where I think I've often thought of this as like Jesus seems to be saying, just pray and ask for things and you'll get them, and good things, but and so why don't we seem to get them, our prayers answered? We talked about the fact that when Jesus is talking about prayer, there's very little asking for stuff. It's more about surrender and alignment to God's will, God's way, right? So prayer isn't about getting stuff. Even I think if that stuff is good, Jesus doesn't seem to be saying, have your list of things that you're asking for. That's what prayer is about. So that we have to hold that in tension with this. And I just wonder with what Jesus is meaning here is, if you search for this way, that the word there is seek in the original language. It's the same word used when Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of God. If we're seeking for that kingdom, if we're asking for it, if we're knocking on the door, and that's our intention, that's our passion, that's our desire to be in alignment, that God's there for us, helping us align, helping transform us, inhabiting our life, supporting us in that way. Just like if our kids were asking for things, we'd want to be supportive and helpful in that way. I'm not sure that this is Jesus saying, keep asking God for stuff on that door. Maybe there's some of that, I don't know. But I think in the context of everything we've been hearing in the Sermon on the Mount, and as Jesus closes out this section, I think Jesus is saying, as it says in Psalm 37, be happy in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. Or some translations say, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. Meaning that as we align, as we surrender to the love of God, our desires are transformed. Remember, we talked about that thing at the beginning with the I and singularity and clarity, and it was around mammon, our desires, and what we really want will be transformed. So we'll be less inclined about getting our own way and more inclined to for there to be forgiveness and love. The whole inside out thing, we will be transformed from the inside out to a point where, as Jesus kind of wraps up this whole sermon in many respects, and everything you do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. Remember, this whole sermon started with Jesus saying, I didn't come to abolish the law. In other words, this way of God needs to be rethought, but the reality, the intent of the law and the prophets that went before, prophets who are often critical and judgmental, right? That this whole way that the Hebrew people had lived and the people of Jesus, they were trying to adhere to, this whole way of life, Jesus has given us insight and opportunity in this beautiful way of alignment with the flow of God's love in the world. So that's basically the Sermon on the Mount in a nutshell, just so you know. Very imperfectly done. We've just spent 5 weeks on it. There's still some more to go in it, the rest of chapter 7, but we dealt with that, talked about it at least at the beginning of the series, where we talked about that good trees produce good fruit, bad trees produce bad fruit. So the fruit of our lives is the proof, the evidence of God's presence in our lives. Jesus called us in this last section to choose the narrow path, the difficult path, and we know living like this is not easy. In other words, don't just default to what your natural tendencies are, but intentionally work at your life. Do the work. Jesus talked about building a house on sand or building a house on rock. In other words, a call for us all to do this hard work, to become people with whom the change can begin. As we would often say here, as sort of inaccurately quoting Gandhi, that be the change you want to see in the world. So in that spirit, we're going to just do a brief meditation now before we move into communion. And it's something which we've done here many times called the welcoming prayer. And it's particularly helpful, I think, when we're having negative emotions. That's what it's intended for. Could be anxiety, could be judgment, anger, could be all kinds of different things we experience, emotions that feel negative to us. There's nothing wrong with emotions, right? Emotions are good, but sometimes they impact us negatively. And there's 4 stages to this prayer, right? And so, maybe anxiety is a way for us to relate to this, but it may be another emotion and that comes to mind as we do this practice. But we become aware of the emotion. So we're going to spend some time doing it where we'll just be aware of what's going on, right? Because often we push our emotions away, or we stuff them down, or we ignore them, or we pretend they're not there because they feel like our enemy. But the premise of this practice is that actually our emotions are our friend. I mean, if they control us, if they run our lives, then they're not our friend, but they can be our friend. So we're going to become aware of them, so aware of it. So we might be aware of anxiety, or maybe hatred or resentment or insecurity or whatever it is, an emotion of guilt or shame that feels very negative to us. And then we're going to welcome it. We're not going to push it away. We're going to say, welcome fear, welcome panic, welcome resentment, which might feel uncomfortable because, again, we're used to pushing these things away. We might even be ashamed of our emotions. And then we're going to connect that emotion, that emotional reaction, to a root cause. What's causing this emotion? And if we never welcome our emotions, if we're not aware of them and don't welcome them, then it's very difficult to get to the root cause of it. A little bit like just breaking the check engine light on our car deliberately to say, oh, my car must be fine now. You know, I'm not going to check that light, or I put a piece of tape over it so I can't see it. Whereas it could actually, that light, it's a pain when it goes on, right? But it could be telling us something that's really important. So we're going to connect this emotion or this emotional feeling to core human emotional needs, right? These are just normal, healthy human needs. It's not an exhaustive list, I don't think, but it's a list that kind of captures, in some respects, the essence of what it means to be human. We all long for safety and security, right? We should do. It's good to be safe. It's good to be secure. We don't always experience it though. We long for esteem and affection, right? We want to be respected. In different settings, we would probably use the term esteem. In other settings, we'd use the term affection. We want to be loved and respected. Another need for us is power and control. That sounds a bit like, well, we shouldn't be controlling. Well, we all need some agency, right? Control over our own circumstances. So these are just normal, healthy human needs. The problem is we don't always experience them. And so what the connection is to connecting that emotional response to one of those three things that I'm not experiencing right now. I'm just not experiencing. We might not feel safe. We might not feel loved. Think about a really close relationship where you're questioning whether you're loved or not, or you're not feeling loved. No amount of demanding it is going to get it for us, right? It's just a reality that we're not experiencing it in that moment. We may need to take some action. We may need to have some conversation as a result of this. But right now, in experiencing that emotion, we're not getting that need fulfilled. So what we're going to do, rather than demanding it and getting fired up with that negative emotional reaction, is we're going to let go of it, as we were talking about last week, afiyemi. We're just going to release it and recognize that in this moment, we do feel insecure. In this moment, we don't feel loved. And we're going to trust God. We're going to just align with the flow of God's love in the world and let it go. Let go of that demand. Okay, so we're going to just practice that now, just for a moment. Maybe we could put the lights down, Greg, a little bit. And this is a very personal thing. So nobody has to say anything. But we're just going to do this, and this might be a practice we can then use in situations where we're feeling it intensely. You may have walked in this morning feeling really emotionally stirred up, and this would be really appropriate. But we've got emotion going on in our lives all the time. So we're just going to spend the first moment being aware of what emotional energy is present in us right now. Feel your body. Where's the tension? Where's the pain? Where's the sense of emptiness? Might help to put your hand on the place in your body where you're feeling that emotion, just to identify with it. And then name it. Labels are hard, but let's do our best and welcome it rather than being ashamed of it or afraid of it or repulsed by it. Welcome it. Welcome anxiety. Welcome that emotion that's showing you something much deeper. And then connect this emotion. Where is this coming from? Is it thwarted safety and security? Is it thwarted power and control? Is it thwarted esteem and affection? Let it be what it is. Doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean it's okay. It may make you realize you need to take certain action, but let it be what it is. And then this is the hard part. Let go of that demand. Accept that that emotional need, which is totally legit, totally healthy, is not being met in you. And let it go. And invite God into that space. In fact, recognize that God is already there and just become aware of that love. Let's just stay in this prayerful place, not be distracted from that. The music team could come up. So I just encourage you, I don't want to distract you right now. I'm going to say a few things, but just stay in that prayerful place. We're going to do communion together, which is an opportunity for us to stay in God's presence. It's a celebration of God's presence. Jesus said, do this to remember me. It's like reminding ourselves as we eat the bread and drink the wine that God is here, that Jesus is here. The Spirit of the risen Christ is mysteriously available. And we'll have an opportunity to move around the room, visit different stations around the room, to take the bread, to take the gluten-free crackers and the fruit juice. Everybody's welcome to do that. And we're also welcome to stay in this place, to stay seated, if that's what we need. So Jesus, we lean into you and your incredible love. We recognize that you see us as little faithlings. And we say, we believe, help our unbelief. We say, we want to be agents of love, peace, hope, and justice, when often our own fears and dysfunctions mean we can barely get out of bed. But you believe in us. You wouldn't have said these things if you didn't believe that we could live that way. And you invite us into that space. So we believe. And we pray that you would align us, help us to align so that we can be in the flow of your love into the world, to break down the systems of injustice, to transform the world around us because of what you're doing in us. So whatever we do now, we're doing it as an act of courage, an act of belief. It may be staying seated, it may be coming and taking gluten-free crackers and the wine, or visiting a station around room, or lighting a candle at the back, or going to the back of the room and asking someone to pray with us. But let's do what we need to do right now. Amen.